In this series, we're diving headfirst into claims made by the American gospel, which is a pretty elaborate production. And where should we start off for this series? Where would be a good jump-off point?
Warren, before we dive into the deep end, we should probably wade into the kiddie pool and define a couple of terms. The first term is familiar to all of us. It's PSA, short for Penal Substitutionary Atonement. The other term is a little less familiar. That's Evangelical Incorporated. Starting with the familiar term, PSA. PSA is the idea, the teaching, that in order to satisfy his wrath against sin, God the Father has to butcher God the Son. Not only is this teaching blasphemous, but it also requires us to swallow a number of equally preposterous concomitants. For example, PSA requires us to believe that Christ pays off humanity's infinite debt to God by means of his finite human nature. It requires us to believe that the crucified Christ is a grotesque mass of sin that causes the Father to turn away in disgust, yet simultaneously, the crucified Christ is the unblemished Lamb of God that satisfies God's wrath against sin once and for all. And while we're talking about lambs, PSA also requires us to believe that Christ is simultaneously the Passover lamb and also the Yom Kippur scapegoat. Never mind that sheep and goats are genetically incompatible genera. Never mind that Passover and Yom Kippur are entirely different festivals. But worst of all, PSA requires us to believe that the God who says, "Woe unto those who call evil good and good evil," himself commits a colossal injustice and then calls that injustice the very thing that satisfies his sense of justice. This theory, this teaching of PSA, is so riddled with systematic inconsistency as to be laughable. But enough on PSA. It's a concept we're familiar with. Let's move on to the less familiar term. That's Evangelical Incorporated. Evangelical Incorporated is all of the authority figures, whether we're talking about systematic theologians or philosophers of religion or seminary professors, in addition to all of the unofficial opinion makers and influencers who compose English-speaking Protestantism. These are also the same people who told us that PSA is the heart of the gospel. Calling PSA the heart of the gospel is something that Evangelical Inc. was able to get away with for a very long time. They were able to get away with it because they controlled all the gatekeeping institutions. For example, Evangelical Incorporated controlled, or at least informed, the thinking of all of the big radio shows. For example, if you were talking about the Bible Answer Man with Hank Hanegraaff, until he converted to Orthodoxy, whether you're talking about Renewing Your Mind with R.C. Sproul, whether you were talking about Grace to You with John MacArthur, or whether you were talking about Insight for Living with Chuck Swindoll, all of these shows and lots of shows like them enforced PSA. Moreover, Evangelical Incorporated was the mind behind all of America's Protestant seminaries. Consequently, every pastor or even any supply preacher filling a pulpit was teaching the congregation PSA. All of this started to change with the advent of blogging, podcasting, and especially with the advent of the video sharing platforms. Because now every dissident voice that prior to then had been suppressed now had a platform to express a critique of PSA. And when Protestants started hearing the critique of PSA, they started realizing how foolish it was. And Protestants began not just rejecting PSA, but they also began rejecting the institution that had taught them PSA, namely Evangelical Incorporated. So they said to the bigwigs, you want to tell me that this foolishness is the heart of the gospel? Fine. I'll go someplace where it's not the heart of the gospel. Consequently, Protestants are fleeing Evangelical Incorporated, fleeing their Protestant churches in droves and going to Eastern Orthodoxy. This started out a decade or two ago, just in dribs and drabs. You had a little stream of people leaving Protestantism and usually going to Eastern Orthodoxy. That little trickle has turned into a flood. People are flooding into Eastern Orthodoxy from Protestantism, and they're not looking back. Evangelical Incorporated has noticed this with great alarm. And one of the manifestations of that alarm is this 17-minute trailer we're looking at. It comes from a larger movie, and this is a chapter from the larger movie called Cosmic Child Abuse, a phrase that comes from Steve Chalk. This trailer is 17 minutes long, and it features some of the big names of the Atonement School defending what you and I now know is the indefensible teaching of PSA.
I mean, Paul, those are some pretty heavy claims to start the whole program off, and this isn't something that you're unwilling to defend or validate. And anyone that's familiar with the program here on Idol Killer, this is a topic that we've visited multiple times, doing in-depth responses, providing a lot of sources and quotes and validating the claims that we're criticizing, as well as authenticating our own claims and showing that we're not just here pulling things out of the air, so to speak. But to someone that's not familiar with the idea of penal substitution, a lot, or they don't have an in-depth understanding of it, a lot of people just understand it as, well, that just is the work of Christ. It's just that Jesus died, he suffered for our sins, he rose again, and that's just penal substitution. But penal substitution is a lot more unique than that. It's not just simply that Christ came, suffered, died, rose again, but it has specific claims. And I think that there's some things that this series does well with addressing those claims, and some things that it does really poorly in addressing and defending some of its unique distinctives. So with that said, I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing where we go with this.
One of the things that the producers of American Gospel did very well was structuring the narrative of this Cosmic Child Abuse trailer. The narrative is very straightforward. It's good guys versus bad guys. The good guys are those professing PSA, of course, whereas the bad guys are a rogues gallery of people claiming that PSA is false. The good guys includes quite a number of heavy hitters. Just let me go through some of the names. For the good guys, we have Mike Winger, Mark Deaver, Alistair Begg, Kevin DeYoung, Paul Washer, Vadi Bakum, Phil Johnson, he was John MacArthur's cabin boy until the latter's death, Phil Howell, and Steve Lawson. All of these people are ordained ministers. Not sure about Steve Lawson because he has since become unpersoned by Evangelical Incorporated. But those are some heavy hitters, some of the big names in the Atonement School. The list of good guys also includes quite a number of lay people. For example, we have Elisa Childers, a very popular podcaster, Stephen Wellham, Russell Berger, Emilio Ramos, and then an unknown person who's just identified as James. They don't give any last name for him. So what we have here are some, stalwart defenders of PSA. On the opposite side, you have the bad guys. Those bad guys include Brian Zahnd, Steve Chalk, Bart Campolo, Nadia Bowles-Weber, Tony Jones, Rob Bell, and Richard Rohr. To quote Obi-Wan Kenobi, you'll never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. The American Gospel people did a really clever job of staging this. They staged some of the nastiest, most undesirable people as the opponents of PSA. That's very clever because if a viewer has no knowledge of the argument, and is just going based on character, well, then naturally the person is going to want to side with these sturdy, stalwart, conservative defenders of biblical orthodoxy, namely Mike Winger, Alistair Begg, and company. And they're simply going to reject out of hand people like Steve Chalk and Nadia Bowles-Weaver. In fact, the only one of the people in that rogues gallery of bad guys that I'll say anything nice about is Brian Zahnd. The reason I'll say something nice about him is because there's a personal anecdote involved. If we go back in time to 2011, just a few months before I launched my own Eastern Orthodox podcast, I was friends with somebody who at that point was already an established Orthodox podcaster. He had a key to a Coptic church that our parish was using alternately with that Coptic church. We're Eastern Orthodox, which is different from the Coptic church, but we were using that church along with them. So he gave me a call one night and he said, "Get your camera and tripod and let's go." So I did. I showed up at that Coptic church. We went in when no one was there. We set up the camera on the tripod and we shot a little skit called The Gospel According to Chairs. This is a skit that demonstrates the restorative and healing nature of the work of Christ, which is what is understood by Eastern Christianity, rather than the penal and substitutionary model, which is understood in Western Christianity. The production quality of the video was abysmally bad. We didn't have a microphone. We didn't have good lighting. We didn't even do any editing on the video. I just popped the memory card out of the camera, handed it to him, and then he uploaded it straight to his YouTube channel. And by the standards of 2011, the video went viral. A short time later, I was cruising YouTube and I discovered that a Protestant pastor had done an exact copy of that skit, only he had done it with much better production values and it did a better job than we had done. And he had given credit where credit was due. He didn't claim to be the originator of the skit. That Protestant pastor was Brian Zahnd. And because of that, I've always had sort of a friendly feeling toward Brian Zahnd. I'm actually Facebook friends with him. And he's about as anti-gun, pro-sodomite, pro-liberal as you can get. Yet, I still have this good feeling for him because he inclines toward what we believe soteriologically. So what you have here is the American gospel has basically set this up in a way that we are forced to think that you are either with the Bible or you are with this rogues gallery of sodomites and God haters. Where the American gospel people step in yogurt is when they allow the bad guys actually to speak.
The God who is mollified by throwing the virgin in the volcano, or the God who is mollified by his son being nailed to a tree, is not the Abba of Jesus.
Some years ago, I wrote a book called The Lost Message of Jesus. In it, I said, the cross is not a form of cosmic child abuse, vengeful father punishing his son for an offense he didn't commit.
But particularly abhorrent is the penal substitutionary atonement theory that turns the father of Jesus into a pagan deity who can only be placated by the barbarism of child sacrifice, and this will not do. It makes God a vindictive monster. Does God really love me, or has he simply been paid off?
I mean, I had this image of God going like, okay, listen, this guy's worthy of death. I don't care if I kill him. I'm going to kill somebody. And I just got to kill somebody out there. And Jesus goes like, you can kill me. And he goes, oh, okay, as long as I get to kill somebody. And the obvious question is like, why does God need to kill anybody in order to forgive?
Why can't God do what he asks us to be able to do, to freely forgive without demanding retribution first?
Jesus doesn't say, punch him in the mouth and then you can forgive him. Or kill their baby and then you can forgive him. He just goes like, just forgive them. If Jesus says we're supposed to forgive each other, why can't God just forgive us?
Again, I go back to the parable of the prodigal son. There was no payment. The father is not paid. He isn't saying, okay, I'm going to forgive that kid for taking the inheritance and squandering it and all of that, but somebody's gonna pay me back. No, there's no payment.
As all theologians should know, the very concept of forgiveness is based on the ancient practice of releasing a debt rather than collecting it from someone else.
It turns God into some kind of like divine child abuser.
Does God really love me, or has he simply been paid off?
I don't think God killed Jesus. You cannot read the Gospels and think that.
And how could that ever be good news?
Like, why would you want to worship a God if you could imagine a better God?
You know, Paul, I love the scriptures. I love the Bible. And one of my favorite verses is Isaiah 55:7, where God is saying, let the wicked man forsake his wicked ways, the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let them return to me, and I will freely pardon them. Some translations say abundantly pardon them. But it's a pardon. It's not. It operates on restorative and redemptive justice, not retributive justice. And so here you have these villains, as you noted, the bad guys are actually more in keeping with God's self-revelation in Scripture when they're criticizing this atonement theory. And I'm shocked that their comments were included in this, because it aligns very well with Scripture. All of their other views notwithstanding, their criticism seems to be on point here.
Right. Their criticisms of PSA are eminently sensible and biblical. Whereas the good guys, the stalwart defenders of PSA, sound like absolute obscurantists. Have a listen to this medley of the good guys speaking.
At the end of the Reformation era, there arose a whole viewpoint known as Socinianism. Socinianism was really going back to earlier heresies. It denied the doctrine of the Trinity, and of course denied the deity of the Son. It denied penal substitution. It ultimately argued that God is a Unitarian God, not Trinitarian, that God is simply able to forgive sins without any kind of atonement or payment for sin.
But this was their argument. If God demands a payment, then he isn't really forgiving. If he forgives, he shouldn't demand a payment. You can either have sins forgiven or paid for, but not both. That's the Socinian argument. And on the face of it, it seems to appeal to human reason. And you might say, well, so what's wrong with that argument? And Scripture answers it clearly. Without shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness.
Forgiveness always requires some sort of sacrifice. So the whole concept of thinking that forgiveness can be offered without an actual sacrifice on God's part doesn't even jive with the way we think about forgiveness in human circumstances and everyday life.
Did God kill Jesus? Yes.
We are saved from God himself.
Oh, that's awful. We're saved from God. Did he say from God himself?
That's what he said.
He said, so Steve Lawson is teaching we're saved from God, not by God to God. The claims here are abysmal. And what I want you to note too, and I'm sure you will, is that this immediately, not only does it posit the good guys as the PSA adherents and the bad guys as these liberal, progressive, weird adherents of different views, but now it's trying to associate a rejection of this atonement with Socinianism. And so now you've got it already is beginning with poisoning the well and associating it with Socinianism. It doesn't seem to be an honest or charitable engagement here.
Yeah, what it reminds me of is Matt Slick was once having a debate against a very charming bearded fellow, otherwise known as Warren McGrew. And when the charming bearded fellow had finished his presentation, Matt Slick responded with, "What you just heard was a heresy fest." All you have to do is throw out the term heresy or liberal or progressive, and immediately the conversation stops. It's like when somebody throws out the word racist, it immediately terminates any kind of further discussion. The narrative that they are peddling in this movie, in this 17-minute trailer, is very simplistic. It's good guys versus bad guys, but we discover that the bad guys are actually making sense, and the good guys sound like obscurantists and blasphemers. Moreover, it's a false narrative because they want you to think that conservative Protestantism equals PSA. False narrative. This is a book called Atonement and Reconciliation, written by Kevin George. Kevin George is a conservative Protestant rejecting PSA. We have another book here, Penal Substitution on Trial, written by Philip Hess. Philip Hess is another conservative Protestant rejecting PSA. We have another book by someone we know, Crushing the Great Serpent, written by Will Hess, another conservative Protestant rejecting PSA. So the question arises, why didn't the producers of the American Gospel series call these three men or men like them and interview them for this show? Well, they couldn't do that because these are conservative Protestants who would be naturally attractive to conservative Protestants who don't yet know the argument, and thus they could sway people over to rejecting PSA. Instead, the producers of this series have to bring in the absolute worst rogues gallery imaginable to make their case.
And one of the things that you noted too, Paul, is it's not just that they couldn't access these guys because some of their work hadn't been written yet, right? I mean, our friend Will Hess is a relatively recent book. This documentary, I think, came out in 2019. So they didn't have access to Will. But like you noted, there were conservative Christian voices that were criticizing and pointing out the flaws and errors of penal substitution even back then. So there are voices, there are opportunities for them to interact with that. And the same good guy group is still out and very active today, making the same claims, but now those authors have been published. So while some of their defenders may say, but that book wasn't out yet, and they may want to hand wave and say, well, we didn't know conservative voices back then. The fact remains that these quote unquote good guys do have information they can interact with now, and they are burying their heads in the sand and doing everything they can to avoid interacting with it, because it does present that conservative, historic Christian criticism of a modern Reformed theory.
We talked about the words heresy, progressive, liberal. One of the people who's a quote unquote good guy or good gal in this series is Elisa Childers, very popular conservative Protestant YouTuber. She is perhaps the most infamous of all of these people for using the terms conservative, progressive, liberal to shut down any further discussion. For example, here's a medley of her doing this, a medley that was put together by the aforementioned very charming bearded fellow, Warren McGrew.
Are humans born basically sinful or basically good? This is a topic that divides, one of the topics that divides progressive Christians from historic Christians, because in my research into progressive Christianity, liberal Christians, progressive Christianity, sort of this current iteration of liberal Christianity, calling itself progressive Christianity, progressive Christian books that I've read, very liberal, theological liberalism. In my research into progressive Christianity, I've said this many times, progressive Christianity, as I read the progressive books,
liberals and progressives,
the progressive mindset, progressive Christianity, progressive Christians, progressive Christian community, progressive circles, progressive Christianity, progressive Christian Pope, progressive movement, progressive leaders, the progressive Pope, progressive Christian community, progressive Christians. So my guest today is Ken Samples, who is the senior research scholar for Reasons to Believe.
That was Elisa Childers, one of the defenders of the true faith according to the American gospel. What's interesting about Elisa Childers is she has had on her show a very prominent Protestant named William Lane Craig. Since the death of John MacArthur this year, and this year is 2025, William Lane Craig has become the 800-pound gorilla in the Atonement School. This is the person to whom all of the Atonement School, all of these so-called good guys, look as a mentor. However, In William Lane Craig's book on the historical Adam, this is what he writes about using the terms liberal and progressive to shut down argument.
In discussing various points of view, I've tried to avoid labels like liberal, progressive, and conservative because these politically charged terms are prejudicial.
You know, I try to call balls and strikes where I see them, and I think William Lane Craig's observation here is sound. It is prejudicial, and I think that's really the motivation in using these terms, because they are somewhat amorphous. They are somewhat easily used and weaponized in order to shut down dissent and disagreement. And so I find myself in agreement with the criticism that Bill Craig is offering here.
Right. And it's not simply these thought-terminating terms that we're dealing with here as well. The Atonement School, which is to say the good guys in the argument, the people who are defending PSA, also set up a number of associated theological points, points that are related to PSA, and insist that these are acid tests for orthodoxy. For example, we're going to go back to Elisa Childers. This is what Elisa Childers says about people who reject original sin.
The next thing to look for when you're trying to figure out if the person you're following is leaning in a more progressive direction is what they're going to teach about the nature of humanity. So one of the core doctrines of Christianity, going back all the way back, is what some people articulate as the doctrine of original sin. Some people don't use that phrase, but if the person you're following denies that there's something broken in humans, that there's something fallen, then I think that's a huge red flag. So progressive Christians won't typically deny that sin exists or that it's bad, but they don't believe that you have an inherent sinfulness in you.
Yeah. So Paul, we just listened to Alyssa Childers talk about original sin as kind of a litmus test for determining conservative Christian orthodoxy versus liberal progressives. But we don't have time to go into it for this program, but we've done a lot of work here on the channel showing how Augustinian anthropology, which is what she's appealing to here, not just like she said that Adam and Eve sinned and there's a myriad of consequences, but she wants to say that there's inherent sinfulness, and that entails guilt when we're conceived. And so one of the issues I want to note real quickly here is that actually entails a corruption of the incarnation and redemptive work of Christ per Hebrews 2, verses 14 through 18. And it also entails a concept known as infant damnation if you're consistent. And so there's dozens and dozens and dozens of other issues with her supposed conservative Christian orthodoxy. And we don't really have a whole lot of time to dig into that, but I would definitely recommend anybody that's watching this and goes, wait a minute, these guys are taking issue with PSA. They're taking issue with original sin as understood by Augustine. Like, what are these guys? A bunch of liberals? The answer is no. We're adherents to early conservative Christianity. We know the work. We've done the work. And I would invite people to engage with it here on the channel. I've got several playlists that I think you'll find very fascinating.
Right. Alyssa Childers, in that same video from which we excerpted, was encouraging people to rely on the testimony of the great Protestant authorities of the Reformation. What she may be ignoring is that all of the confessions of belief of the Reformation told us that Christ has a human nature exactly like ours. And one thing that Calvinism deals with very badly is explaining how, if Christ has a human nature like ours, Christ does not have original sin. But wait, there's more. Getting back to William Lane Craig, the mentor of all of these people, including Elisa Childers, and now the 800-pound gorilla in the Atonement School, we're going to return to his book, The Quest for the Historical Adam. Here is what William Lane Craig writes about original sin, and it's not favorable.
Nowhere in the New Testament is Christ said to have died for original sin. It is dubious that the doctrine of original sin is essential to the Christian faith. The doctrine enjoys slim scriptural support, to put it mildly, not to be found in the account of Genesis 3 of the curses following the fall. The doctrine depends entirely on one biblical passage, Romans 5:12 to 21. And that passage is vague and open to multiple interpretations. Paul does not teach clearly that either, 1, Adam's sin is imputed to every one of his descendants, or 2, Adam's sin resulted in a corruption of human nature, or a privation of original righteousness that is transmitted to all of his descendants.
Bravo to William Lane Craig for recognizing this, obvious fact to anybody that's engaged in biblical exegesis and study of the scriptures. So I'm a fan of his opinion on this topic.
Yes, and it is devastating to the producers of American Gospel, because William Lane Craig, who is now the biggest name defending PSA, now that John MacArthur is recently deceased, now that William Lane Craig is the big face of PSA, how are they going to get around this? Because obviously, speaking against original sin, and by extension, speaking against PSA, does not make one a liberal. However, the producers of American Gospel keep giving their whole college try. Here's a clip where they show a Christian pitted against Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, of course, being a very far left, in fact, Marxist thinker in the American Congress.
They do not know God because they've rejected Jesus Christ the Son and they stand condemned. Do you think that's respectful of other religions?
Senator, I'm a Christian.
The obvious implication of that clip is either you are with these good, patriotic PSA defenders, or you're with this Marxist piece of you-know-what, Bernie Sanders. One thing that's distinguishing of Marxism is the phrase redistribution of wealth. The Marxists are very keen on the idea of redistributing everyone else's wealth. That's bad. Unfortunately for the Atonement School, and unfortunately for the producers of the American Gospel series, they once again run into their 800-pound gorilla, who's supposed to be their mentor and ally, William Lane Craig.
To begin with, I think it's important to understand how inextricably intertwined natural evil and moral evil are in the world. If there were no moral evil in the world, then the natural sufferings would be unbelievably reduced. I mean, can you imagine what the world would be like if everyone always lived in accordance with the teachings of Jesus? What a wonderful world that would be. If there were a drought in Ethiopia, then the world would rush to the aid of the people there to prevent famine. The wealth of the world would largely be redistributed instead of hoarded in the materialistic Western nations.
Warren, what we just heard there was an audio clip from William Lane Craig from about 29 years ago. In that audio clip, he is endorsing not only redistribution of wealth, which is the Marxist/Bernie Sanders position, but he also had to get in his little virtue signaling white guilt jab by saying it's the evil white Western nations that are hoarding all this guilt. That means that Bernie Sanders and William Lane Craig are birds of a feather. I'm not exactly sure what the producers of the American Gospel are going to do with that. And by the way, if anybody thinks that I manufactured that audio clip with artificial intelligence, this is the CD album that it came from. The Problem of Evil, which was published by Biola University. They have since let it go out of print. I'm wondering why.
Yeah, I mean, we just listened to Bernie Lane Craig there talking about redistribution of wealth. Just a moment ago, we heard him denying original sin. And yet, the Atonement School, these adherents of PSA, are saying all of these red flags should be going off, and yet he's the one they're looking to defend and champion penal substitution. It seems like maybe their spider sense isn't working or tingling. It should be alerting them to some of these inconsistencies, but it just seems like they're completely oblivious. I think perhaps it's because they put him in the inside of the gate, and so they give him a pass on these other issues.
It is exactly that.
Well, we have another episode coming up in this series. We're wanting this to be responding to the claims that are made. We want it to be brief, impactful, and put out a response to this. What do we have coming up in our next episode?
Warren, what we're going to do in our next episode is called PSA in Caricature and Reality. As we have already shown multitudes of time in the series, the various series that we've done together, the favorite defense of the Atonement School is to claim that people like us are simply caricaturing the dogma. We're going to look at that in some rather deep depth in that next episode.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that. That'll be great. I want to thank everybody for tuning into this first episode in this series. Be sure to check out all episodes. We leave our comment section open below. So if you disagree, if you want to push back, if you want to challenge, or if you want to just express your agreement, whatever the case is, you're free to do so down there. Thank you for everyone for tuning in, for watching, supporting the channel, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Putting on Christ is not one among many jobs a Christian has to do, and it is not a sort of special exercise for the top class. It is the whole of Christianity. Christianity offers nothing else at all. C.S. Lewis.